Hey, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for inviting us in on this one.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, happy to have you. Let's give it maybe 2 to 3 minutes and see if more people join. Jim, are you going to be presenting today or?
I was more planning to run this as a Q&A session. I'm happy to give a brief background about what we're doing with
yeah.
Mariner and Linux from Microsoft, things like that. I wasn't looking to present any significant content.
Oh, sure, that works. Sounds good.
Morning.
Good morning. All right, if you can add yourself as an attendee on the meeting minutes, so that we can track who's on the meeting, and I think we can get started. So Jim, thanks for joining, and happy to have you. And would like to learn more about the CBL Mariner project and where you're at, and what's new.
Sounds good. We've got Chris Coe here, who is one of the dev leads for Mariner as well. I'm on the program management side of it. Chris is one of the dev leads, so he can answer some of the more technical questions if we get into that. The short version for what we're doing with Mariner is Microsoft found a need for its own Linux distribution to power a number of the services inside Microsoft that are driven by Linux. I think we've said fairly publicly that about 60% of the cloud so far of Azure is driven by Linux, and Mariner is one of the ways in which we are looking at kind of consolidating and providing some boundaries around that for our internal teams. Rather than letting them run kind of whatever distribution they want, Mariner gives us the ability to kind of standardize, make sure that we have better interoperability, better testing, and it provides us a supply chain security story, in that all of the code that we are running is something that we can build, validate, verify, and sign all internally, all through the already established kind of code validation processes, things like that. But for me, one of the biggest things that Mariner provides to Microsoft is the ability for kind of faster feature velocity. If we look at something like the recent landlock kernel improvements that Microsoft has upstreamed into the Linux kernel, it'll take time for that feature to trickle down into RHEL, into Canonical's Ubuntu, into other Linux distributions. Whereas we've upstreamed that source, we can roll it into our distribution and build features around that as quickly as it makes sense for us to do. And so while we are working with the upstreams, while we are partnering with them and trying to get these features integrated into distributions, we're able to use ours as kind of a proof point and say, look, we know this works, we're running it in production.
It makes sense.
Questions?
So this is not in all the services yet at Microsoft, and basically you're trying to standardize on this across the board?
We're looking to standardize where it makes sense. I won't say across the board, because we're not looking to dictate to teams that, they must run this thing, we're ruling from on high. We are looking to provide it as a default for teams that find a need to run a Linux service, and we're looking to provide a better experience, or at least a more structured and certified experience for internal teams. We're providing the basis for FedRAMP authorization, for FIPS compliance. We're working with CIS vendors, things like that. But we also recognize that Mariner is fairly new. We only released the distribution. It's really only been in existence since, Chris, keep me honest here, I want to say September of 2020.
Yeah, that's about right. That's when we first released 1.0.
So we released our 1.0 around then. We're running about a 2-year life cycle. We've just released our 2.0 portion, or our 2.0 release. And now we're beginning to look at making Mariner available for public use as well. One of the things that we've been pushing for on our team is the internal usage isn't really any different from the external usage. We want to treat internal teams and customers as roughly the same. So what we're solving for our own teams also matters for solving for customer problems as well.
Gotcha. And so it's Mariner targeted more container type of workloads, or any type of workload?
That gets a bit into the nuance for support. Internally, we're using it kind of across the board. We have VM spaces, container spaces. It is still very cloud focused, and the design is meant to be very minimal. So we're not looking at supporting GUI. You're not going to be running GNOME or anything like that on it. We're mostly looking at cloud focused workloads, and that could be anything from, I need a VM that runs Nginx or something along those lines, to I need an ephemeral Cloud Shell instance in Azure. Cloud Shell is one of the Azure services that does run Mariner now. And that's basically, we provide AZ-CLI and a bunch of other tools basically for customers in the browser experience. But beyond that, for customer use, we're targeting the AKS container host primarily. So if you're more familiar with, Amazon, you could kind of sort of squint and call it a bottle rocket equivalent. That's not entirely accurate, but it's close enough.
Yeah. But I think Bottle Rocket has some sort of API access to. I think they does Mariner have that too, or it doesn't? I guess.
The API structures are not currently there. That's one of the things that we're looking at possibly integrating in for future development. We're not the only team that would need to do dev work around that in order to make that happen across Azure. So it's one of the things that it's internally, it's kind of a collaborative approach.
Got it. Yeah, and then for the Cloud Shell, you're using a container too, right? So that's so you're using the, or is that a VM that you spin up every time you spin up
No,
a Cloud Shell?
Cloud Shell is a container, yes.
So the container is running Mariner, I guess, right? So
Yep.
Yeah, got it.
Yeah, the Docker file for it's all in GitHub. It's all publicly available stuff.
And then you, I mean, one of the main things that you mentioned is you're looking at making sure that the base OS is compliant with a lot of different things. So I think that's a lot of value add, I think, for customers, because that I think a lot of organizations go through the pain of going through compliance, and when they have to patch up the operating system and all that. Yeah, so
yeah, compliance is a big part of it. The other is that we're able to, because we're specifically targeting Azure, because this is basically for Microsoft services, we're tuning and targeting exactly what we need for the Azure cloud for best performance. If we're using a lot of other distributions, if we're taking, I'll pick on Ubuntu or, CentOS, it really doesn't matter. Those distributions are much more generally available. They're not specifically tuned for Azure, and we can't expect the teams to know how to appropriately tune everything all the time for the best performance or the best experience. That's something that with Mariner we're trying to do out of the box.
gotcha. Any questions from anybody on the call?
Chris, keep me honest here. Have I said anything that you think is wrong?
That all sounded really good. So
Yep. Just a few question. The first one is whether some do you know any other user or any customer are using this OS except the Azure?
So everything is very Azure focused, but there are other services within Microsoft that are using Mariner or Mariner components. So if you look at some of the edge devices that we've shipped, AKS HCI, which is basically like an on-prem Azure scenario, Azure Arc, even WSL, some of these things are all powered by Mariner under the hood. The graphical stack for WSL in Windows 11 uses Mariner components. We're not providing a GUI or anything like that, but the pipelines for it that allow the graphical representation are all there. For AKS HCI and for Arc, Mariner is the container host that is there. That's been out in the market for a little over a year, I think. So this basically it allows us to provide a bit more standardization and consistent user experience, edge, cloud, however we're rolling it out, whatever the product is, teams know exactly how to interact with it.
Okay, that's great. And one more question is that I think does this OS support such as automatic update or maybe some rollback similar to Cloud OS, something like that? I just went through the README as the GitHub. It didn't mention such kind of feature. I'm not sure whether I missed.
It depends on how it's being implemented, is kind of the answer to that question. We do support, or there are products that support image-based rollbacks.
Mhm.
AKS HCI is one of those. They take an image as an update, so they can roll forward, they can roll backward. If you're doing package-based updates, technically that functionality exists. Mariner is an RPM-based distribution.
Mhm.
Historically, RPM has not been the best at being able to do package rollback. It technically works, but if any of the post-install scripts have changed formats or things like that, it can leave the system in an inconsistent state. So we're not solving base RPM package issues that have existed for a while, but there are aspects to the distribution that do allow for that level of support. And that's one of the things, at least with AKS and some of the services like that, where it is an image-based update, we do have the option to do a full rollback and say, no, hang on a second, we're either going to fail forward to the next version if we notice a problem, or we retag a previous version and fail back to that.
Okay. Okay. I see. Thanks.
Is there any relation between Mariner and the WSL, or they're just completely different initiatives?
There is a relationship there in that they consume some of the components that we have, but they are different products. They ship a different kernel than we do. We're not looking to kind of consolidate in that way. But because Mariner is kind of the becoming the standard for Microsoft, where they do need some Linux components, we are trying to collaborate rather than having, you know, a bunch of different teams do things a bunch of different ways.
Got
It
it.
might be more useful to think of like the core repositories for Mariner and the core Mariner product as a bit of a factory that allows, you know, assembly of parts in a number of different ways.
Got it. Got it.
I have a question. So I kind of want to understand the history here. It's a very interesting project. I've spent a few minutes now going through kind of the code, seeing how it's built. I wanted to know what kind of tools you were using before to apply to do the same thing, and what were their limitations that resulted you in having to build this? Because I know of several other tools that are kind of similar. I mean, Bottle Rocket was mentioned earlier. This is super container specific, but then there's like Cloud Foundry Bosch, and then there's Packer. You know, what tools were you looking at before that just didn't meet the kind of requirements that you were looking for that you've now built into Mariner?
To some extent, it's not that the tools didn't meet the need. It's that inside Microsoft and inside most larger companies, you have requirements for you know, supply chain acquisition, for dependencies, things like that. And if you leave those sorts of decisions up to individual teams, you'll get 12 different ways to solve 10 problems. So to some extent, this is a bit of a standardization effort. To some extent, we didn't want to look at other distributions and then try to enhance them with some of the features that we were looking at. Let's see if I could pick on a public one. I'll look at SimCrypt, which is another thing that's kind of public on the Microsoft's GitHub namespace. Within that application, we have the ability to kind of track and control SSL certificates that are in use. From our perspective, that really helps us because we can expire and roll keys very quickly across a fleet if we need to. That same feature, if we tried to put that into Fedora or Ubuntu or RHEL or something as a default option for OpenSSL, we would get so much heat for you're spying on us, you're watching what we're doing, and that's not the intent of the feature at all. It could be used that way, absolutely, but from our perspective, from a fleet management thing, no. If I need to roll a new intermediate certificate and everything downstream from that certificate quickly, I want the ability to do that. And so we bake that into some features for internal use. The code for that's all public. Like I said, SimCrypt is available on GitHub. People can go poke around in it, see what they want. But Microsoft has a bit of a history with Linux, and we're trying to be fairly deliberate and delicate about how we manage that and what that looks like in the future.
No, it makes sense. I got you.
That's a good question, though. That the origin for Mariner is a little interesting, and to some extent, some of the I'll say that the 20-plus-year-old sins of the past now definitely factored into, decisions for what do we do? Do we pick an external distribution and then go participate in the community there and, risk heat? Do we try to build our own? What do we need to do? There were a lot of those discussions early on.
Sure. Yeah, I can imagine that there's kind of almost political in some sense, some of these decisions. But this is a kernel, right, that you're building. You're basically building like the bare Linux kernel, but then you're also putting RPM on top of it, and then you're creating a distribution basically.
We build everything soup to nuts. We take the source code for everything. This is entirely a brand new distribution.
Sure.
Yeah.
That has its positives and also has its negatives, because now you're sinking time and effort into maintaining a new distribution. Yep. Whilst you also simultaneously have customers requesting the use of a different distribution. For example, when they're provisioning Azure services and they're like, oh, hey, I want Ubuntu or I want whatever. They're picking this, and then you have to kind of like the kernel, like both kernels have to be, is in my understanding, like they both have to be tailored for like Azure. So now you're like sharing a code base almost, like where you're tailoring the kernel specifically for your hardware. Is that shared at all, or are you literally doing that in two different places?
No, so everything that we do is fully public. Our development happens in GitHub. Our management is very explicit that we're not taking any proprietary code. We're not taking anything that has not been upstreamed. We are trying to do this distribution exactly the right way. So as kind of a part of that, yes, you're right. We are bringing about a lot of new effort that we wouldn't have if we just took, Ubuntu or CentOS or whatever thing and tried to run with it. However, we want to give customers the option. So again, it comes back to, if we're solving our challenges for internal usage where we need to have, code base control and sovereign supply chain and blah, blah, blah. We also have customers that expect a single owner for all of their problems. This is kind of a common marketing message that you'll see from, Red Hat, from Canonical, from us, where a customer wants to call one number for support and they want support the entire way through the stack. And sometimes they want Ubuntu, and that's great. Sometimes they want RHEL, that's great. Sometimes they want Microsoft to just own all of their problems all the way down, and that's what we're here for. We're solving our internal problems that we have for ourselves, but we also want to give customers that option. If they want Microsoft to have control of everything and they just want to call one number when something breaks, that's great. We're not going to force decisions on anybody or anything like that.
I think I'll also add on there, specifically for something like, a kernel change that will benefit Azure that we'll have on our distribution. We'll also be sharing that with the other distros as well, because we do know that folks do want to use other distros, and we want those to also work really well in Azure.
Does that mean you work with the upstream communities for all those distros, or is it something that you do on your own?
This is working through the upstream communities, and then especially with like the kernel, right? As Jim was saying, all of our patches are upstream, are like in the upstream mailing list, if not already going into mainline kernel. And then we will be working with different teams within Microsoft, but we'll be working with the different distros like Canonical to try and port them over into the supported distributions that they run on Azure.
Got it.
No, thank you.
I will come in and throw a hardball question for fun. All
Sure.
right, so darlings, this is a fantastic open source product or project, really. How do you contribute?
Let me unmute so there we can minimize on the crosstalk for that one. Because it's a GitHub thing, anybody can file a pull request against the repository. There are plenty of GitHub issues that are coming from outside Microsoft, things like that already. This is one of the areas of growth that Chris and I have been discussing along with a few of the other developers on the team, because we don't right now have a more, call it formalized or policy driven approach for contribution. It's kind of loose right now. We've had people contribute in the past. It hasn't been an issue, but I do want to put a bit more policy around it to, say, look, we're trying to stick with LTS versions of packages. We want you to format things in this way. If you make a change in this particular code structure, you also have to update these other two files, and probably a little bit of tooling to make some of those more common activities a bit friendlier. Chris, you want to take more on this one since that's more in your area?
Yeah, this is an area that we are wanting to improve as a whole, because it can be a little bit daunting when you first look at the repository, how to contribute. And that's a feedback we've gotten as a whole. It's something that we're looking at. A lot of it goes into improving our documentation around it too. So I think
in all honesty, it's one of those things where it is particularly challenging to be able to contribute back in towards a kind of Linux subsystem. So I was curious about how you were handling that. And it sounds like you all are well on your way towards being able to have that be a robust policy decision. So.
I mean, I would prefer it if people didn't look at the mono repo structure that we had and run away screaming immediately. So, a contributor's guide or entry level documentation is probably a good thing for us to do in the next couple months.
I mean, it's always nice to have a roadmap. So, all right, I will pass it back to Ricardo.
Yeah, along the lines of the contributing, are you the only maintainers now, or do you have any other external contributors? Or
we've had a few external contributors. We had some folks from Kinvolk and Flatcar helping out for a bit. We've had a couple of I'll refer to them as drive-by contributors for Chris. Who was that? That was the maintainer for syslog ng, I think. Who came in and threw a couple of patches our way at first. But for the most part, yeah, it's almost the vast majority right now is Microsoft contribution. And that's something that we may look to change in the future.
So, similar question, are you planning to work with the CNCF or planning to apply for Sandbox or any of the CNCF?
For Mariner specifically, likely no. I don't know that would make a ton of sense for the distribution and what we're looking at. That said, a number of our peer teams within Microsoft are working with the CNCF. We'll probably have some contributions into CNCF tooling and code bases where different distribution exists. Mm-hmm. So, if there's an Alpine thing and a Mariner thing, or an Alpine thing and a Ubuntu thing, a CentOS thing for some of the build scripts, we'll probably put some tooling in there in the future to add Mariner as an option. But Amy said it in the chat, I don't think it makes sense for the distro itself to be a CNCF thing.
Got it.
But within the CNCF, I mean, other teams, Lockheed and several other folks from Microsoft are already doing piles of contributions. You've got Andy Randall and some of the other Kinvolk folks running around. So we're in the ecosystem. We're just not looking to contribute quite that directly.
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, it's just
Yeah,
it's
I'll
kinda
follow up
curious.
on some of that. Like, I mean, the tricky part about being able to bring in a distro was kind of like, how would you ever graduate? Like, how would you walk through like the particular gateways that, and yeah, I see Talos Dev did apply. CNCF, TOC is going to be reviewing all of those applications next week. We might have more things to be able to say about that then, but realistically, like, I don't know how you move from sandbox to incubation as distribution. So.
Yeah, I think there were some questions about some of the Kubernetes distributions. I mean, they're not
Yeah.
like operating systems, like I think K3S is in Sandbox, and
Exactly.
they
Yeah,
have a
it makes a little bit more sense to be able to have some of like the Kubernetes distributions, a proper Linux host. We've not had anything come up directly yet to be able to actually test this, but my feeling is it might not be the best fit, but we'll see. TOC gets to be able to decide this one.
yeah. But it would be interesting to have some sort of mechanism to help these type of projects too. I mean, if they're
Oh
not
yeah,
part of Sandbox, right? So they could be something else, right? So I don't know.
yeah. I mean, like, just because we don't have the spaces right now doesn't mean we couldn't.
Right.
Yeah. Because I mean, lots of things have evolved in the ecosystem over the last 3 years. Who knew?
Exactly. Cool. Any other questions? All right. Well, thanks for joining, and yeah, we're looking forward to seeing the project mature, and looking forward to seeing how it's used and continues to be used in Microsoft, and maybe possibly a lot of other organizations.
Sounds good. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Good to see you all.
Okay, bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye
Thank
bye.
you.